Good afternoon. This is Assemblywoman Petrie-Norris. Thanks so much for joining us today. Like so many of you, I was so excited to watch the Mars Perseverance rover on February 18th. What an amazing day for science and discovery. Well, today we have a fantastic follow-up. I am really pleased to be joined by John McCann, who is a senior mechanical engineer of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. John was an integral part of the Mars Perseverance rover mission and supported the cruise, entry, descent, and landing teams. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
And so for folks at home, John is going to share some of his experiences with us, give us kind of an inside scoop on what was happening behind the scenes, and also explain to our younger viewers how you can also get involved in STEM fields. So John, to kick us off, can you just tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, so take me all the way back. I grew up in the San Francisco East Bay. My grandfather worked for the Air Force, or Army Air Corps to start with, from like 39 through the 70s. And so I grew up hearing like all these stories about aerospace. And so I went into mechanical engineering down at here at UC Irvine. And, you know, great experience living here in Irvine, living near the beach. I then went to work for the Boeing company in Huntington Beach, where I was for about 20 years, working on a range of programs. And until, you know, as opportunity came up to be able to go to JPL.
And so we've got some young aspiring scientists and engineers watching us today. So can you tell us a little bit more? I guess first, tell us, you know, what is JPL?
Great. So the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is one of the NASA centers. It's a little unique in that we are not actually civil servants. We're actually employees of Caltech. So Caltech, the university, runs JPL for the federal government. So it is paid by the federal government. We have a whole bunch of different missions. We primarily focus on robotic missions to planets, also to the Earth. And we get missions either that are given to us to go do. We also compete with other NASA centers for missions in a multi-year process. And we conduct, we're very much like a college campus in some ways. We're about 6,000 people up in Pasadena, kind of straddling Pasadena and La Cañada Flint Ridge. We are mostly engineers, at least that engineers make up a largest percentage of people at JPL, but we're also scientists and we're technicians and people who build the spacecraft. And so we work with private companies who then build components for us. We integrate them together, we test them, and then we operate them. So we have the first operational flight center or operations room in the United States was at JPL, started for back in the very early days of the space program.
Okay, and so you said JPL is one of the NASA centers. How many NASA centers are there in the country?
Oh, goodness. I think we're about 11. I should have looked that up beforehand.
Okay. So one of about 11. And you said there's 6,000 super smart engineers and scientists at JPL. Wow, that's incredible. Okay, and so when it comes to a project like the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover, how did you kind of get picked to work on the project? How did you get involved?
Great question. So I went to work, I left Boeing in 2017. And so then I went to work at JPL. There's a lot of different programs that are going on at the same time. So as an engineer, you may actually be working on multiple projects depending on what the need is. So I'm a mechanical engineer, and so different programs may need a mechanical engineer to look at and work on different things. Being somebody who had parachute experience from when I had worked at Boeing on the Boeing Starliner spacecraft, I was chosen to help out in the parachute area. So I initially was in some of the parachute reviews, and then supported the Aspire mission. So the Aspire missions, the Advanced Supersonic Parachute Inflation Research Experiments Program. Long acronym. We have lots and lots of acronyms. And so my role on that was to be involved in the development of the experiment section, which is, well, and to explain the mission a little bit better, on Mars, the atmosphere is a lot thinner than on Earth. So at about the point that the altitude that we deploy our parachute on Mars is equivalent to to Earth's atmosphere at 100,000 feet. So to get up there and to get into those conditions that we need to simulate Mars, we need to use a supersonic, we need to do a supersonic test using a sounding rocket. So we built a section of sounding rocket to contain the parachute and have all the sensors in it and cameras in it. It was then put on a sounding rocket that was launched out of Wallops, which is another NASA center that launches off of the East Coast. And so we fired multiple missions to go deploy this parachute and see how it inflates. And it's very unique conditions. And that's some of the challenges with doing things at Mars or the other planets, is how do you recreate those conditions and prove that it's going to work at those locations? And so sometimes you have to use a rocket to do that. So my, I supported that mission through the experiment section work, as well as some of the other operations of just trying to recover the parachute so we can inspect it after flight and also get the data off. So we work with our colleagues over at Wallops, and we were very successful in both seeing the parachute inflate, getting all the data, getting the parachute back to see what did it experience during that inflation. Is it actually going to work?
And so this is how many times have we successfully landed on Mars? This is like the third or fourth?
Well, no, we had 2 flights of Viking in the 70s. We had Mars Pathfinder in the late 90s. We had the 2 MER rovers, Opportunity and Spirit. We've had some failures too, but we then had Insight, which went off 2 years ago now, Mars Science Laboratory, and now we've had Perseverance. So I wasn't counting as I was going along the way, right. But
I think maybe that's like five. Okay, so this is you were part of the 5th time that or 5th or 6th time that we've gone there. How long does a project like this take? So for many of this, we watch kind of the final hours of the amazing landing from beginning to end. Though, how long were you working on this project?
So basically it started in 2012, 2013 is when we called it Mars 2020 for the longest time. So they kind of set the date. We're going to launch in 2020. So yeah, it takes several years, sometimes up to a decade, to get these programs off the ground. It goes through multiple phases. So if you read more details about how these spacecraft are developed, you'll hear things like phase A, phase B, phase C. So pre-phase A is like the early study phase, and you have a handful of people thinking about what are we going to do on Mars? What does this mission look like? What are our objectives? We then move into phase A, where we're trying to figure out what this thing really looks like. Phase B, now we're starting to test and prove that the concept that we have is going to work. And each of these phases is roughly a year, year and a half. Then you get into C and D, start actually building it, testing it, qualifying it, and then you actually fly it. You get into phase E, where you're operational. So, for example, we're now in phase E for Perseverance. I'm now working on a program called Mars Sample Return, or Sample Retrieval Lander, which is going to go grab the samples that Perseverance is ultimately going to take and return them to Earth. We're in phase A. So we're still very early. We're making big changes. We're a ways from building anything at the moment. So yes, it's long time commitments for these programs. That's
phenomenal. So the project is something like 8 or 9 years. How does that even start? Like, when you're setting out to make that project plan, how do you start, right? Like, how do you go from, how do you go from kind of a blank screen? I've worked with So I was part of a number of startups,
Mm-hmm.
and I love the being in a room with 3 or 4 people and a whiteboard and sort of creating something out of nothing. But we didn't really create anything like a rover that could land on Mars. It was a lot more straightforward. How do you even start on something like that? What does the
Oh, great
first day of that
question.
project look like?
Well, first it is you're trying to figure out what are you going to go do? What's your objective?
Mm-hmm.
And so, for Mars 2020 or Perseverance, it's we're building upon all our prior missions. We've discovered, yes, there was water on Mars. There could have been conditions, ripe for life to start. Now we actually got to go see, was there life? Is there signs that there was life of some sort there? And so you start thinking, what science do we need to do? What do we need to look at? What tests do we need to do? How big of a rover? How much power do we need? Now, for something like this mission, we had just flown Mars Science Laboratory. We had proven out this amazing way of using sky crane to get a giant rover to the surface. And so we had a lot of hardware left over from it. So you sort of had some of your means to get there already on this mission. But now you have to marry up and figure out, well, what are my objectives, and start building to figure out, brainstorm, what are the different ways I could do this mission? And so sometimes, you start spitballing and putting ideas up, and you start realizing, well, that is going to be too heavy, or that's going to take too much power, or that's just too risky. The technologies, sometimes they sound great, but you're not going to be able to develop it in the time frame that you have that you want to do your mission in. Or your costs are just going to be too high to be able to do it. So there's a brainstorming, and then there's sort of a culling of the different options. And, you start working through then to finer and finer detail for how these things are actually going to look. How are they going to go together? One of the biggest challenges with anything space related is everything's vying for a small amount of space and a small amount of mass that you can put at it. And so trying to figure out the best way of doing it when you take into account mass and power and thermal, we see vacuum, we see hot temperatures, we see cold temperatures, we see lots of load. So these things also have to survive all that. And so we work through it. We'll start off doing like very basic, back of the envelope type calculations. And then we will eventually work towards doing detailed simulations. Sometimes some of our concepts, as we get further along, they look better. Sometimes they look worse. And so you have to kind of keep going, and you have to keep working, and you have to keep using your imagination to come up with new ideas. We're constantly hit with problem after problem after problem. And so this whole process is really about problem solving, figuring out what the problem is, figuring out what your options are, and then figuring out how to decide what's the best way of solving that problem.
And so over a project that's lasting 8 or 9 years, technology is changing so fast these days.
Mm-hmm.
Like, were you in a situation where you had to kind of modify your solution because there had been some, new innovations, new technology that you were able to leverage, or is the stuff you're using doesn't change that fast?
Well, it is changing, and computer technology, for example, is changing. Camera technology has been changing immensely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the space environment is really challenging because so many things are not built for the conditions that we see out in space. The high temperatures, the cold temperatures, sometimes at the same time. You can have in space, you can have on one side of the spacecraft is negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the other side it's positive 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And you also deal with there's low pressure. So for example, if you have a fan that cools off something, well, you can't necessarily use it if the air pressure is so low that there's no air to actually do the cooling. So there's only certain technologies we can use for space, or when we take technologies to use for space, we sometimes have to modify them. But we also have to develop our own technologies. And the lab has a long history of developing its own technologies for doing things. because we have a lot of very unique problems that we have to solve.
And I know you've mentioned in previous interviews that one of the most important and enjoyable parts of your job is working with your team. Can you share some of the memorable experiences that you had with your team during the project?
Yeah, so Aspire was it was kind of like a side project almost. We were very focused on getting a rocket together to be able to fire the rocket off and do the testing. We spent a lot of time out in Virginia, this little island called Chincoteague, where we usually stay. And it's just, everything was done in teams because no one person can do everything. So you have a team of a lot of experts who are, very smart, but very focused, very driven. And, you all work together towards this common goal. And so, you all go out to dinner each evening. It's kind of fun being around a bunch of other nerds. So we talk about nerdy things. So it's that kind of camaraderie of the group of people who are all focused on some objective, working together to go solve it. So yeah, a lot of fun out there working with them. The project I'm working on now is great from the standpoint of we're in the very early phases, so we're all using our imagination and we're kind of fighting. It's a battle of ideas in that we have different ways of solving these problems, and you gotta like stand up and prove it. You've got to like give the evidence, give your rationale for it, and I mean at the end of the day, it's fun. I mean I have to say it's just a huge amount of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun.
And how did you all adapt? So the last year of the project was in kind of our COVID reality. How did you and your team adapt to that? Great question. So, one of the things I guess that helped us get into it was that we were already used to working with multiple sites and other centers. So we use software similar to Zoom to do our meetings, because we work with all the various other NASA centers on these programs. So we work with NASA Ames and NASA Langley. Ames is up in San Jose. NASA Langley is out in Virginia. NASA Marshall in Huntsville. And so we're on similar type meetings like this day in, day out normally. But so we were kind of used to it to some extent. So I think that helped a lot. But there was still a big adjustment. We had to learn how to really convey things when you can't sit, a person face to face. You had mentioned about, working things out on a whiteboard, and most of our meeting rooms have a whiteboard. And at some point, if you're really working through some hard problem, it's like, okay, let's go up on the whiteboard and we start working it out there. We can't do that. So we're working in, for example, PowerPoint, and it doesn't draw nearly as well, which makes it challenging. But we're a little bit used to it. I think the fun additional challenge though is the other elements to working at home. The first month or so of the pandemic, my daughter couldn't go to her daycare. She's 2, and so I'd be in meetings with her on my lap, and she would be like, watching cartoons up on a screen behind and hitting me because she wanted to get down or chase the dog or something like that. So we've also had those sorts of challenges, and you just everybody's in it. So you have to extend grace, knowing that, okay, we're doing the best we can. Right. Well, yes. And that even NASA engineers have to, are grappling with those same everyday challenges that all of us have been grappling with. And so
that's right.
At home, we got to watch that kind of final hour before Perseverance landed. And I think even for us, we were kind of watching that landing with like bated breath. And when we heard that, like there was that kind of cheer on the landing, I mean, it makes me well up with emotion. What did that feel like for you?
Yeah, it was nervous, obviously. I mean, the anxiety going into it, have you done everything you needed to do? And there's a certain amount of confidence though, because you're surrounded by all these amazing people who have done this job, and you know how competent and focused they are. And it's not like one person can make a mistake that causes the mission to go. We're a team. And so, you know, you just have this huge confidence that it's going to work. And if it doesn't work, it's kind of like, well, it wasn't meant to be. You know, it's sort of an act of God that it doesn't work. Because it's usually multiple things that have gone wrong, things that you couldn't have imagined in your wildest dreams that could cause it to go wrong. But still to actually see it, you know, that it works, that, you know, yeah, it definitely makes you emotional. I'm starting to get emotional thinking about it. And so we had post-landing, you know, we had our own, you know, Zoom call essentially, you know, where everybody was on it for the press conference. And so there was a lot of elation and joking and singing and yeah, a lot of smiles throughout the whole thing. So it was great to see everybody, you know, in this kind of mutual expression. And then to see the videos the following, you know, few days afterward were just awe-inspiring. So,
yeah,
you know, as Al Chen, who's the EDL phase lead for Perseverance, you know, said it's the stuff of dreams. And, you know, you work on this program for like 8 years and you dream every, you know, thing that could happen. You have sometimes bad dreams. You imagine all the terrible things that could happen, sort of nightmares, but you live it kind of over and over as you think about the system that you're working on, that you've analyzed or you've designed or that you've actually watched be built. And so it's like you're there to some extent, but then still to actually see the video was still just breathtaking.
Yeah, it seems, I actually just watched it again right before we got on this call, and it just seems like it's impossible to believe it's real, right? It's so, like you said, kind of the stuff of dreams, and it just it kind of puts such a unique perspective on our world, right? It's so easy to get caught up in like the, you know, the day-to-day minutia, and there is just something about like that kind of stepping back and realizing the enormity of the universe that just I always find it kind of resituates me and changes my perspective. So what is next for the mission?
Great. So right now they're still in the process of basically doing their checkouts. So they've been they deployed the arm today, and they've been turning various things on and doing checkouts of it. You know, it's been stowed 7 months in deep cold for this whole time. And so the team has been turning things on, updating software. I mean, you know, it had Perseverance, the computers within the rover itself are what flew the vehicle down to the surface. Well, now it doesn't need that software anymore for flying it to the surface, the EDL software. So that's removed, and then they give it all the software that it needs for running the surface mission. And then they start checking out all the different instruments, the arm, you know, the masts, taking pictures. I think tomorrow they're going to be doing their first drive, if I'm right. So we get updates every day. You know, everything right now, by the way, is nominal. So everything's like super healthy, working good. They're going to do a drive, and then I think the following day they're going to go search out the zone where they want to fly the helicopter. So, and then next week they're going to be flying the helicopter, which is going to be incredible. You know, crossing fingers for that one, because that's, you know, that one was, I mean, we weren't sure if that was going to get put on the mission initially, because it's such a huge challenge. And so the dynamic, you know, if you ever fly a helicopter yourself, it can be a little challenging just within Earth environment. But the dynamics of a helicopter and how it flies in the, you know, the very thin atmosphere of Mars is actually very different. So they used a vacuum chamber at JPL to fly a model, you know, basically a prototype version of it, so that they could get a computer to learn how to fly it. So it's very different control laws than what have been done before. And so that was an amazing feat. And so all that work, we'll see what happens with the flight next week.
And is this the first time? So that's the first time we've done that. I say we. That's the first time.
Yeah.
Wow. And okay. So, and just what are we trying? Tell us a little bit about the scope of the mission. So you talked about what are we trying to learn over the next? Well, I guess how long is this going to last?
Oh, great question. There's usually a primary mission, which is I think a year.
Okay.
But then it will likely get continued on further and further. So typically you'll design for some minimal amount of time to achieve your objectives. Mm-hmm. But we also don't know how long it's going to last, but we usually design them well enough that they can actually last longer. So the objectives is multifold. They're going to be looking at geology. So they're going to be looking at the different types of sediment or rock types that are in this area in Jezero Crater. They're going to be doing astrobiology. So they're going to be looking in detail. They'll do spectroscopy to look at what compounds are there. Are there organic compounds or signs, that there was organic activity? They'll also be taking samples, core samples of key areas that look very interesting. So some of one of the other objectives, the last objectives, is to start preparing the way for humans to visit Mars. And so they have a device called MOXIE on board. And MOXIE essentially is going to take the carbon atmosphere that we find on Mars and then transform it and make oxygen out of it. So to see, is this something we could do? We could utilize the resources that are there on Mars to actually make the things that we need as humans to be able to survive there. So that's a very early, kind of trailblazing type of experiment that's going to go on.
Wow. And okay, so in kind of big picture, it's the mission is trying to see if there's signs of life on Mars, right? And okay, so what do you think? What's your hypothesis?
Oof, well, we're going to a great spot on Mars to go look for it. First of all, this is actually was a very difficult place to get to. Mars Science Laboratory was looking at Jezero Crater, but when they looked at the topology, it was just too dangerous. But it was such a good potential scientific, source to go get data from, because it was an ancient lake about the size of Lake Tahoe. It has a delta where a river ran out and deployed sediment into an alluvial fan or a delta area like you might see at the mouth of a river. And then there's also a chunk that has been taken out of it from a more recent meteorite strike. So of places that you could potentially find signs that there was ancient life, that would be a great place. A very shallow area in a sea. You have, rich sediment that's potentially coming down from other mountains, volcanic mountains in an area called Northeast Syrtis, which is nearby out to the west. So, with these, I think you're going to find some signs that there was biological activity. I'm crossing my fingers there. One of the challenges, though, is it's not enough to show that, well, there's something here that could have been made by biological processes. It's proving that they were by showing that it couldn't have been other processes. So I think one of the challenges for the amount of instruments that you have on the rover is you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know what chemical signatures you're going to find, what evidence of what biological process. And so you're very limited in, what instruments you could put on board, because we're limited on mass and size. So, we may not be able to rule out that a particular organic looking molecule, piece of soil wasn't made from some non-biological process. And so that's where bringing the samples back to Earth is a big benefit. It takes us 10 years sometimes to get a new mission to Mars. Well, that's a long learning curve to be able to change what experiment you're going to do, to be able to see if there was life. So being able to bring the samples back is really what's needed to, I think, ultimately confirm that there's going to be life, or that there was life rather. So I think we're going to find something. I think it's probably going to be inconclusive on the surface, but you know, that's purely just my thought.
Right.
Not being the astrobiologist, being the mechanical engineer. So.
And what role is we talked about the helicopter. What role is the helicopter doing as part of all of this?
So it's primarily a technology demonstration. So it's sort of an add-on mission. Okay. It has the great potential future benefit to future missions. Now, it could potentially help this mission because we're going to be looking around this delta, which has lots of crags to it and elevation change. Potentially at the end of, once we're done with Jezero, the idea is they may take the rover up and out of the crater and go to another area which has potential other signs of life to it. Well, it's a somewhat treacherous path to get out. And so being able to have an aerial surveillance could help us. But really, the primary mission of it is technology demonstration for future missions. So, it has a camera on board. It'll be able to see stuff, which would be amazing to see a video taken from it, maybe looking back at Perseverance. Mm-hmm. But it is that future missions that, we're trying to pave the way and stepping stones to being able to do better and bigger things.
Got it. Because if we can prove that it can fly, it can be flown by this computer, it can be controlled, and then you're able to include that when you're planning your next mission, and it can do more kind of surveillance and other work. Okay. All right. We got some questions now that have been submitted to us from some students. First question, how did Perseverance get its name?
Great. So JPL's had, or I should say NASA's had this history for all of our rovers, has had a competition for school students to write in and suggest names. And so they open up to everybody in the US, I think up to the age of 18. And and I want to make sure I got his name right. Mather is his last name. A seventh grader back east submitted the name and submitted like a whole reason why to call the rover Perseverance. And great write-up, and amazingly, it also, you think of that name, well, we've had to persevere throughout getting it built under the COVID conditions. And in general, we've had to persevere through this whole last year. And so at the time the name was chosen was kind of before we really realized how, appropriate that name is.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. So it was named by a seventh grader. I had no idea. What were some of the biggest hurdles that you and your team faced during this project? Speaking of Perseverance. Yeah. So maybe because there's two areas that I think were some of the biggest hurdles, and the parachute I kind of talked about. Every program going to Mars has had some issue during development of parachutes, ripping apart or having some sort of issue. And a development program that preceded Perseverance called Low Density Supersonic Decelerator. Basically, it was a big inner tube around a capsule that was flown by a rocket out in Hawaii to test out this big inflatable version of an aeroshell. They also had a parachute on board, and unfortunately it disintegrated, and it broke apart under conditions that we thought would have no problem flying at. And that got us concerned about parachutes. Can we actually predict them? Have we just gotten lucky in the past is one way of looking at it. And so that started JPL to start looking at parachutes more deeply. And we came up with a more strengthened parachute. So the parachute that we flew for Perseverance is actually designed to higher load and stronger materials than the one that Mars Science Laboratory flew on, even though they're roughly the same size. So that was, and then we needed to do a supersonic, rocket program to actually test that out. So that was kind of the one that's near and dear to me personally, but
One of the other big challenges they had was in the whole sample caching system. So they have the front end of the rover is essentially a trunk or a box, about, you can't really see my arms, but, it's like a steamer trunk in size. And it's a bit of a Swiss watch in terms of arms and gears. And what it does is the rover is going to take samples from the ground, from interesting areas that look like that may have biological signatures or have some other minerals that are very interesting. It puts it in this adaptive caching assembly, ACA, as it's called, and it cleans those samples, it catalogs them, it takes a picture of them, it weighs them, it does all this stuff, and it has to do it completely remotely, and it has to do it under the most cleanly conditions that we've ever applied to a program before. The requirements for the cleanliness were so high that standard cleaners were not clean enough for it. Paints and the things that we typically will treat metals with to make sure that they preserve and don't rust, don't oxidize or have issues, were also not pure enough. And so the team had to redo how they did things, and from a chemical, digging in the chemistry books and figuring out, how can we meet these super tough cleanliness standards? Because we don't want to take these samples, think that there's life, and it turns out, well, no, it's, because we contaminated it.
Oh, right.
So, we want to get it back to Earth. And, that was one of the biggest challenges for the team. There was a lot of redesign and rework. And, you have this big challenge of this thing has to operate remotely without a human there to hit stop. If there's any problems that go on, it has to sense them, stop, and, be able to correct or wait for instructions from Earth.
So next question, let's see. The rover is on Mars looking for signs of life. How is it going to do that? What instruments does it have to do it?
All right. So I actually had a cheat sheet because I can't, we have lots of acronyms. And so unless you work in a particular team, you often don't know what, you don't remember what the acronyms are. So I do have a cheat sheet. So some of the instruments, we have a mast cam. So that's basically the head of the rover and the eyes of the rover. So more advanced optics, we're going to be doing more amazing panoramas with that high definition. We have META, which is a Mars Environmental Dynamics Analyzer. So we'll be looking at the wind speed, air density, all those to be able to understand the atmosphere more. We have MOXIE, which I mentioned earlier, which is Mars Oxygen ISRU, which is like in situ resource utilization experiment, which is going to transform carbon dioxide into breathable oxygen. At least that's the idea. There's PIXL, planetary instrument for X-ray lithochemistry. So litho being a dirt, Earth, being able to actually then really examine at a fine detail what is the chemical makeup of the dirt samples that we take from Mars. There's RIMFAX, which is the radar imager for Mars subsurface experiment. I'm getting tongue-tied there. Which is a ground penetrating radar, so we can look at the structure of the ground underneath. Often so much of this is covered by dust, and so you can't tell what the structure of the ground is underneath you. And so that's where a ground penetrating radar comes in. Scanning habitable environments with Raman and luminance for organics and chemicals, SHERLOC. So that's why we use the acronyms, because who can remember the full name of it?
Right.
So it's going to be doing, again, fine scale mineralogy. We're going to be looking for these signs of organic chemicals. And so some of the instruments that are going to help us see those.
And so if I understood you correctly, some of that analysis is going to happen kind of in real time by the rover. Is that what happens?
Mm-hmm.
And then
that's right.
In some cases, though, we're bringing materials back to Earth. Is that what you said? No.
Yeah. So kind of important to me because now I'm actually working on kind of the next phase. Yeah. But Perseverance is actually the first mission of a 3-mission campaign. It's the first time we've actually done anything like this, where we have multiple missions working together. So it's going to first scout around Jezero Crater. It's going to be doing, looking at geology, looking for signs of ancient life. It'll be taking samples, and then it's going to eventually leave these samples on the surface of Mars in a place, we call it a depot, a sample depot. And so these tubes that are about, this long, which contain about a chalk-sized piece of Martian regolith, we'll leave a bunch there in that first location. We may start scouting around other locations on Mars, and we may actually put other samples in another location, but that's future decision-making. We'll decide all that. The next mission is called Sample Retrieval Lander. And that's the one I'm currently working on. And so we'll launch in 2026. It actually will take us 2 years to get to Mars. We're trying to get the right day that we want to land on Mars. And so the orbital mechanics work out that it takes us 2 years to set all the conditions up right. And we're going to land a lander that has on board a small little fetch rover about the size of the MER Opportunity and Spirit rovers, would be built by the European Space Agency. That will go off and get the samples that Perseverance dropped, load them, bring them back to the lander, where we have on board what's called the Mars Ascent System, a rocket. So a rocket on board the lander an arm will take the samples, load them into the front end of this rocket, fire the rocket off into a low Mars orbit, where the third mission, which was also launched in 2026, built in part by the Europeans, but also with Goddard Space Flight Center, will spot this sample, which will be in about the size of a volleyball. We call it the OS, the orbital sample. It'll spot it in orbit. It will then fly down and capture it in a system called CCRS, which is the Capture, Containment, and Return System, and put it into an entry vehicle. And then it's going to fly back to Earth. Now, it takes a couple of years to come back to Earth, and then it'll enter the atmosphere and land in Utah, where then the samples will be available for the next several decades for scientists to be able to review and do that important science that does take time. I mentioned earlier about how it's not just enough to show that, this could have been made by organic processes. To prove it, you have to prove that it wasn't potentially 5 or 6 different other things. Well, we can't put 5 or 6 different other instruments on the rover, for example. But if you have it back in a facility back in Earth, you can go do that. You can bring in whatever instruments you need, maybe develop new instruments that don't currently exist, and do it in a relatively rapid fashion. And so much like the Apollo moon rocks, they were studying those for decades afterward and learned all kinds of things about the formation of the moon, formation of the Earth, the early solar system. So this is going to get us a whole bunch more information now about Mars, which is, a body that has an atmosphere that is, when you look at some of the pictures, you think you're looking at the deserts of the Southwest. So that's one of the things that's neat and intriguing, is something that's maybe so close to home yet so far out there.
Okay, and everything that you just described in terms of this kind of phase 2 and phase 3, that's all stuff that's never been done before, right?
That's right. So some say this will be the most complex robotic mission that's ever been done. So we have a lot of challenges. Right now, the phase we're in is we have lots of challenges. We have lots of ideas. Mm-hmm. Some look like they'll work. Some don't. It's kind of a roller coaster of different concepts and things that we're trying out. And so even if I were to describe show you a picture of what our current concept was, it's going to be different tomorrow. We're sort of in that very early phase, which is both, it's crazy and hectic, but it's also a lot of fun too, because it's like pulling from the ether is one term, out of pure imagination. But then we have to, of course, do the physics and prove that it'll work.
I think it just must be just such an incredible thrill. I understand that there's so many, parts of the team that went into the actual design, but I'm just even having like that, like one idea that was, that nugget that was yours, that was sketched on that whiteboard, 8 or 9 years ago, seeing that actually come to fruition and actually land just must be phenomenal. All right, I've got a couple of more questions from our students before we wrap up. So how big is the Rover?
So it's about the size of a Mini Cooper, to give you an idea.
Okay. That's bigger than I thought. Yeah, I wasn't sure what I expected. And now when you call the Rover, you also call it Perseverance, right? Or is the mission Perseverance, or you call the Rover Perseverance?
It's kind of both. I don't know that there's some specific definition. Yeah, the Rover specifically is called Perseverance. I think because we had worked with it under the name Mars 2020 for so long, that's sort of the default, the Mars 2020 program and the Perseverance rover. But now we've sort of discarded all the other pieces that existed, and so now the focus is the rover.
Got it. All right. The position you work in has been described as 7 minutes of terror. Is that true? And what does that mean? Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So part of it is the not knowing. So Mars is far enough away, it takes 11 minutes for light to get there, or 11 minutes for light to get back, or for radio signals to come back. It takes about 7 minutes from the time that the spacecraft hits the outer atmosphere to the time it touches down. So by the time we find out, we start getting information about what's happening. It's already happened. Everything's already happened.
Got it.
There's nothing we can do to change it at that point. But it's about 7 minutes for the spacecraft to go. Once it touches the atmosphere, it starts picking up first load. It starts seeing the pressure of the atmosphere as it's starting to enter. And it also starts getting heated. So the outside of the spacecraft starts heating up about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We have an aeroshell that's around the rover. So the rover is sitting inside essentially an egg, I'll call it, of an entry vehicle. And we have special materials on board that can basically burn and take the heat away from it as it's as it enters and goes through entry. But it's not just passively just entering the atmosphere. It actually needs to get to the landing site that we're going to. So we use what's called a modified Apollo guidance program. So it was a guidance program that was developed for the Apollo program because they knew they're coming back from the moon doing 11 kilometers per second. So they have a lot of energy, kinetic energy, that they had to burn off. And so it has to fly in and kind of test, how much load is it getting, how much heating is it getting, so that it doesn't burn up, it doesn't break up. It's a little bit, but also you don't want to overshoot where you want to land, and you don't want to fall short. And so I liken it to skiing down a hill in that, you slalom back and forth. And if you're starting to go too slow, you kind of straighten up and you don't go back and forth as much. If you're going too fast, you turn more. That's kind of like what the spacecraft does as it enters the atmosphere, is it modulates the amount of heating and load that it gets. It still sees, like I said, 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the outside. It sees about 12, 13 times the force of gravity during entry. So everything sees a lot of load. And then we slow down. We get into what's called a heading alignment phase, where we try to aim right at our target that we're flying towards. We're still slowing down. But then we have to get ready. We want to deploy our parachute. And we get down to around Mach 2, just under Mach 2 on Perseverance, to deploy our parachute. And it's the biggest supersonic parachute that's ever been flown, at the highest load for that sort of parachute. And so that's why we were very concerned about it. It's high speeds, you can't simulate these conditions. So we were very worried about the parachute. So when we heard it good shoot, slowing down, that was like huge relief. But you're not done yet. You're not done yet. So you wait. You have to deploy your heat shield, get it released. You then use your radar to get radar lock on the ground, see how high you are. And what was new for Perseverance was the use of terrain relative navigation. So this, I mentioned earlier that the area that we were going to was more treacherous than what MSL would have been capable of landing at.
Okay.
You can only see so much, by the way, from the satellite imagery of Mars. And so they designed the rover, for example, so that anything you can't see, you're big enough that it doesn't matter. But the problem is this area at Jezero, there was too many bad spots, dangerous spots within the landing ellipse, either big rocks or sand pits, basically. It doesn't do well on really thin sand. It would get stuck. And so terrain relative navigation was necessary to be able to fly it to a safe location. In fact, without it, we'd either been stuck or it would have been a failed mission. So a computer is looking at the ground and finds different features like craters or rock outcroppings that match data in its library. And once it sees those, it goes, oh, I know where I'm at.
Okay.
It also has a map of green zones, basically safe landing zones. And it says, well, if I'm here, my closest safe zone is there. And so then it flies to the safe zone. And in the video, you see it pitches over, heads over to that safe zone, and then it has to slow down. So sorry, my hand gets into the camera there, and stop it, and then drop straight down. Of course, everything sounds great, in us describing it. To actually watch it happen in the video was amazing, that it happened just like we imagined it. But you're still not done. You've gotten your landing site, and now you're descending, and now you deploy the rover, drop the rover down, and then you begin what's called the accordion. So they start dropping down until the rover touches down. And the computer on board the descent state, well, actually it's on the rover, but it basically realizes that there's not as much load on the descent stage, which is the jetpack up above. And it realizes, oh, I've touched down. And at that point, it cuts all the lines, and that descent stage flies away so that it doesn't have a chance of hurting the rover.
Got it.
So yeah.
Wow.
And the challenge with Mars is, I'm going to compare this to Earth because I worked on Earth missions before. Earth missions, you slow down, maybe it takes 20 minutes to get through, and then you get on your main parachute, and now you're actually waiting minutes for you to get to the ground. You're going pretty slow. On Mars, the air is so thin, you barely slow down. Everything is so fast. Every second counts. We actually have what we call time margin. So we look at from each event to each event, how much time does it take? Because time counts so much. The less time that we have, the less mass we can take, for example. So yeah, that 7 minutes is a jam-packed 7 minutes where every single second.
Of terror.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. A couple more questions. What is your favorite space movie or favorite movie about space?
Easy. Star Wars. I'm a definite Star Wars nut. I saw Star Wars when I was, 3, the first one, in the theater. And I had 2 VHS tapes when we got a VHS player, which, by the way, students on the line, VHS was these big tapes like this big that had a tape in it. So I have to describe that. I had 2. I had Star Wars, and I had a documentary of the Apollo program, and I wore those tapes out, watching them almost constantly. So yeah, Star Wars was definitely my number one.
Number one. How long before humans are going to be able to visit Mars?
Wow. All right, that is the question. So Elon Musk is making amazing strides with that. So waiting to see. They've had some challenges, but the way they do things, they just go for it, and so they make amazing bounds. To give you an idea, the 2030s are actually, from an atmospheric standpoint, are actually a pretty good time to land on Mars. The air is a bit thicker. So here's the interesting thing with Mars. Not every opportunity of going to Mars is created equal. We could only go there about every 2 years, but as it turns out, the orbit of Mars takes it further away from the sun. It's more elliptical than, say, the Earth's orbit. So sometimes Mars is further away, and what happens is the air on Mars actually condenses and becomes ice, dry ice at the poles. That means that there's less air for us to decelerate ourselves to get to the surface. And that actually translates into mass. So, for example, the year 2030 is, well, I'm going to make sure I have my years right, but yeah, the year 2030 is not so good a year. Or is it 2032? I can't remember launch date versus landing date, but the early 2030s are not so good for landing on Mars, but the later 2030s get better. So there's an opportunity there. And Mars goes through these cycles. Okay. So the 2030s look good. I'm hoping for the 2030s.
That is so much earlier than I thought you were going to say. But that's incredible.
Well, that might be hopeful from my, you know, I'm hoping for the 2030s because I'll still be working at that time.
Yeah. So then, you know, one last question before we wrap up. So, do you want to go to Mars?
I definitely would like to, but I also am kind of getting at the age where I kind of like hanging out here, and so to be perfectly honest,
2 years in a spaceship.
Yeah, taking, well, it's, you know, it could be even on the fast track, you know, it's like 7-8 months there, you know, to get there, 2 years to stay there, another 7-8 months to get back. You know, it's a big commitment, and you know, away from family and all that. That would probably be the biggest challenge. When I was younger, I would have told you, yeah, I'm ready to go now. But
well, listen, John, it was so wonderful to talk to you, and just really appreciate you giving us this kind of insider perspective on this incredible mission. So excited to stay in touch with you, and please keep us posted on phase 2 and 3. You know, we'll be able to watch. We'll be able to watch some of this stuff coming back from Perseverance at home as well.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, they should be good about showing videos and panoramas and pictures and all that. Especially watch for the helicopter flight. So yeah.
All right. Well, we'll
thank you.
Keep our eyes out for that. Thank you again. We really appreciate it, and everything you're working on. So exciting. With that, everybody, to everybody at home, thank you so much for joining us, and be safe and stay well. We'll see you next time.